The world was told a beautiful story. A story about growth. A story about partnership. A story about a rising nation that only wanted to help others rise with it. Leaders shook hands. Cameras flashed. Agreements were signed with smiles that looked genuine. Poor nations were promised highways, ports, power plants, and prosperity. People were told this was a new era, a future where everyone wins. But what if that future was never meant for everyone? What if behind the glowing speeches and glossy presentations there was a darker plan quietly unfolding? A plan built not on friendship, but on control. Not on development, but dependence. Because while the world was busy celebrating China's rise, something else was happening. Something most people didn't notice until it was too late. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. China didn't want to conquer the world with tanks or bombs. That would be too obvious, too messy, too costly. Instead, it chose a far more dangerous weapon: debt, influence, silence. And this is the story of how a nation turned promises into chains, development into domination, and dreams into leverage, all while the world watched. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back, way back. Because this plan didn't start overnight. China's hunger for power was born from humiliation. For centuries, it watched Western empires dominate global trade, control oceans, and decide the fate of nations. China was once strong, then broken, then ignored. And when it finally rose again, it made one silent promise to itself: never be weak again. Never depend on anyone. Never let another power decide its future. So China studied the world carefully. It watched how America built influence through military bases, how Europe used banks and institutions, how the IMF and World Bank controlled economies through conditions and pressure. And then China chose a different path, a smarter one. Instead of forcing nations, it would invite them. Instead of invading, it would invest. Instead of ruling openly, it would pull strings quietly. The Belt and Road Initiative was announced as the project of the century, a massive network connecting Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond through roads, railways, ports, and power plants. More than 150 countries were invited. Trillions of dollars were promised. And for many struggling nations, this felt like salvation. Western banks had rejected them. IMF loans came with painful conditions. China, on the other hand, asked very few questions. Money came fast, deals were signed faster, and hope spread like wildfire. But here's the twist. China wasn't giving aid, it was giving loans. Loans designed in a way that failure was not a possibility, it was the plan. Because these projects weren't built to help local economies, they were built to serve China's long-term interests. Chinese companies got the contracts, Chinese workers got the jobs, Chinese materials were used. And when projects failed, as many of them did, the debt remained. That's when the real game began. Ports that couldn't operate, airports with no passengers, highways leading nowhere. When countries couldn't repay, China didn't ask for cash, it asked for control. Strategic ports, energy grids, land leases for 99 years. Slowly, silently, China began planting its flag not on land, but on leverage. Sri Lanka lost a major port. African nations lost control of resources. Small economies found themselves trapped, unable to escape without collapsing entirely. And while leaders struggled behind closed doors, ordinary people paid the price. But this wasn't just about poor nations. China's ambition was global. Through technology, it pushed surveillance systems into foreign cities, Through telecom networks, it gained access to data. Through digital infrastructure, it shaped how information flows. 5G networks, smart cities, facial recognition, all sold as innovation, all designed for control. What nobody expected was how deep this influence would go. Because when China builds your ports, it watches your trade. When it builds your networks, it sees your data. When it finances your government, it influences your decisions. This wasn't colonization with soldiers, it was colonization with contracts. And the scariest part? Most countries agreed willingly. Even powerful nations began to realize something was wrong, but by then, the grip was already tight. Critics were silenced with economic pressure. Countries that spoke out faced trade punishments. Companies that challenged China were cut off from markets. Fear replaced partnership, and slowly the world began to split. Those who depended on China and those who feared it. Behind closed doors, governments whispered the same question. How do you escape a trap built with your own signature? For China, the goal was never just money. It was influence, obedience, and a future where no global decision could be made without its approval.
But this plan came at a cost. As debts piled up, resentment grew. Protests erupted. Governments collapsed. People realized the shiny buildings meant nothing if their country no longer belonged to them. China's image began to crack. What was once called development was now called exploitation. What was once partnership was now called domination. And the world started pushing back. Deals were canceled, projects were halted, alternatives were created. But the damage was already done. Because influence doesn't disappear overnight. Ports still stand, contracts still bind, dependencies still exist. China may not control the world yet, but it has placed itself everywhere that matters. And that was always the plan. Not to rule openly, not to attack loudly, but to be impossible to ignore. Today, the world stands at a crossroads. One path leads to cooperation built on transparency and trust. The other leads to silent control disguised as progress. The question is no longer whether China had a plan. The question is, did the world realize it in time? Because the most dangerous empires aren't built with weapons. They're built with promises.